Hello, good evening, and welcome to the 35th George Oppen Memorial Lecture. The Poetry Center at San Francisco State University is extraordinarily pleased to welcome poet, essayist, scholar, and organizer Erica Hunt. Um, the George Oppen Memorial Lecture was first given in 1985. It's a lecture series that is funded by the Dorothy A. Fowler Trust. A little bit about Erica as we start. Erica earned her BA from San Francisco State University and her MFA from Bennington College. She is the author of the beautiful collaborative text Arcade, which she worked on with artist Allison Sard. Her other collections of poetry include Local History, which was published originally in 1993 and then expanded and republished in 2003. Peace Logic, the chapbook Time Slips Right Before Your Eyes, and most recently, Jump the Clock, a selected poetry that covers Hunt's decades-long practice. This volume is a significant collection of poetry. Among other things, Hunt's poetry is the study of being present and of being's presence across time. exploring histories of a family, of modes of thinking, of the griefs of Black mothers and women, of a neighborhood. It is poetry lit by the power of thought's potential through language to tear open new possibilities of experience. This work keeps non-standard time and calls standard forms and time into question. This is poetry's power. And serious and illuminating language play animate the decades of brilliant work that rends and renders singular and communal selves. Hunt has written poetry that is an exclamation that should be felt all over the planet. Associated with language poetry, Hunt draws on critical race theory, history, jazz, and experiences of the everyday in her work. In an artist statement for the Foundation for Contemporary Art, she writes, as is true with many poets, I am drawn to language for its music, for language's capacity to limn thought, its connection to experience, its power to still and magnify the world while one writes, reads the world book. But equally, I've been interested in techniques that purposely unsettle the crisp ride and appropriate shade of register and vocabulary. I like to read or write to topple the balance between controlled illusion and opacity. And so I have been drawn to the disjunctions of surrealism, Olepians, improvisers, and scat cats as aesthetic methods to seek new and unsuspected connection. This makes it sound like too tranquil an operation. I write poems that teeter on the verge of legibility, blur private and public, set boundaries anew, and implicate us as practitioners of this moment and the next. Hunt's essays, including notes for an oppositional poetics and reflections on the Black avant-garde, are well known and influential. She is the recipient of honors and awards from the Fund for Poetry and the Foundation for Contemporary Arts and fellowships from Duke University, University of Cape Town, a fellowship in public policy, and the Center for Programs in Contemporary Writing at the University of Pennsylvania, where she was a fellow in poetics and poetic practices. She is taught at Wesleyan University, Long Island University, and is currently the Bonderman Visiting Professor of Literary Practice at Brown University in the Literary Arts Department. I welcome you to this evening, and let's join in welcoming Erica Hunt to present her lecture. Um, I have the title here. Um, she will tell you the title of her Oppen lecture. So join us. Um, welcome, Erica.
Hi, Tonya. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you so much for that great introduction. And okay.
Um, I don't see you.
Huh.
We only see a picture of you.
Hi. There
There
I am
you
again.
are.
Okay. I'll start again. Well, good evening, and thank you for that introduction, that lovely introduction. I feel welcomed into the Zoom room. Um, I do have a title for the lecture. As usual, it's a meditation. So think of this as a meditation and noodle along with me. Meditations on the otherwise, counterculture and Black radicality. And it's given here on the occasion of the George Oppen Memorial Lecture. I'm very pleased to be speaking with you all tonight. I'm grateful for this occasion and to be prompted by George Oppen's poems to bring some of his words into the present and his language to this present company and to our present circumstances, and to glean meaning from juxtaposition, his then our now, his now, and our then, hopefully to create some kind of new substance. I want to thank Steve Dickinson and Elise Ficara, and to thank Tonya Foster, the hosts for this evening. I want to give thanks to Rachel Blau-Duplessis and Adam Fitzgerald, who spurred me on in tonight's speculations with this caveat. I hereby release them from responsibility for whatever feints or glosses and flaws that may follow. They are my own meanderings, my own mishearings. I am the parent to these contentions, and my dear friends bear no responsibility. Change glasses here. Before I begin, I also want to acknowledge that we gather on the unceded land of Turtle Island here and there, symbolic and real. In particular, I speak from Brooklyn, New York, home of the Lenape and Canarsie nations, people who never surrendered their home place. I recognize and hope to honor the Lenape elders past and present, as well as future generations, taking these steps and adding them to other steps for the process of dismantling, dispossession, and displacement, and the legacies of settler colonialism. Finally, I must acknowledge that we bring inescapably into this Zoom room tonight with us, even unbidden. We try to bring our whole selves, but we're also bringing our 4 years of trauma and harm, a cascading catastrophe that predates the current clumsy regime, but culminates in a cresting crisis nested among many others. The unchecked spread of the coronavirus, a superabundant churn of our livelihoods and of our lives. Economic turmoil, where many family members and neighbors teeter on the edge of hunger or homelessness, or severe illness, or have lost their lives. In what the timid term polarization, but somehow that misses the garrote at the neck of the body politic and the violent kidnapping we have all experienced of America's rather tentative democratic political system. You know, for some of us, the last few weeks have felt like months. A life of lockdown under this confederacy. It's a confederacy of liars, and they're fed by zombie beliefs rushing from a tomb in order to preserve their legends, their lies. It's undead. We can sometimes feel grim and hemmed in by grief, by the flimsiness of reform. And maybe we even dared that what we were experiencing in prior years was systemic change. No more. As a high volume consumer of news and political analysis, as someone who sifts through news sources daily, the left and the center right, and where the center right lies more frequently and with deadly results, there's no trust left. No trust when lying liars say they are telling the truth this time, really, when they predict the coronavirus this winter will worsen. So what I want to get down to in this talk as well is not just George Oppen and a picture of his times and a picture of our times, but also some thought about how poetry can be part of how we think our way through this. And when we get through it, what we can do with poetry on the other side of the pandemic. I'll start by summarizing the very idiosyncratic terrain of my talk this evening. I start with George Oppen. I'm curious to revisit his work, reflect on his life many years after my first encounter with him as a young poet, as I was the young poet some years ago. I wonder how the times of his poetic formation, the 1930s and so on, are different or similar than the 70s, the time of my formation as a poet. And with this time, when we are experiencing a similar churning and turning and burning, and then onto the obvious differences of race, gender, and class, and the fact of my body and my embodiment. See, you can see who I am. In an instant, I'm a Black woman, a mature Black woman, and in an instant, seeing me opens a door, a torrent of assumption. It shifts certain burdens onto my back if I let you. And it burdens my language with things I have not said in this language that we say we speak in common. And while I will only touch on how shared language is raced and gendered, and that even our humanity may be raced and gendered, or that privilege and neutrality are not unmarked, I just want us to be curious again, to wonder about how we come to a poetry practice, how we come to poetry practices that will refresh our vision and generate space for living freely, the rehearsals for living freely, more wholly. Rehearsal is a key term for me, with the understanding that a vision of being free requires rehearsal. You see, it's iterative, a recurring occurrence, rereading within one's own lifetime and beyond one's own lifetime. So let's get started. I read George Oppen now as a late middle-aged Black cis woman poet accustomed to being in an almost constant state of rage. It's a rage I've gotten accustomed to. It was ready for me before I was ready for it. It simmers there, always at a body temperature. I read George Oppen now as a late middle-aged professor, Black professor of literary practice. I'm an adept reader with hyper-focused attention to the words on the page and what they are doing. I'm interested in the structural aspects of a poem that direct the reader's attention. I'm interested in the craft and obvious care and ethics legible on the page, ready to stand by the words. I read George Oppen now, remembering the poetry reader I was, who read his work years ago. I was a young poet interested in how to make words do things on the page, not only on the page, but also in the world, out of thin air, to actualize this rather wild supposition of a common language, morphologically similar, but whose semantics and meanings seem to me very different, various. Where it will land, who knows, with its miscellany of psychological layers and separate philosophical frames and specific echoes and tail ends of past usages, radically different from one another. Poetry, no less, where all of this personal and social usage, cultural resonance and dissonance could be parsed and revealed. I read George Oppen now through his life as a modernist poet, ethical person, spouse, a parent, an organizer, a maker of things, objects, sailor, a peripatetic traveler. As a founder of the Objectivists, a loose grouping of poets that included Charles Reznikoff, Louis Zukowski, a favorite, occasionally William Carlos Williams, and then there was Ezra Pound and Basil Bunting, Carl Rakoczy, Lorraine Nidecker, and others. And as is true with many groups of people or poets who are band together or who are lumped together or who hang out with each other, as in the New York School or Black Arts or language, their differences were as easy to point out as their similarities. The similarities, such as they could agree on, included commitments to write an American poetry, mutable, mutating, hybridizing, a break from the glacial, monumental poetries of the British Anglophonic tradition with its reflexive hierarchies and genuflections. Objectivism meant to present events or objects in direct language, grounded in experience, and even in a paradoxically authoritative way, to be anti-authoritarian. The objectivists were leftist, radical in response to their 30s milieu and to the rising tide of totalitarian power. Oppen, born in 1908, came to young adulthood in the late 20s. So try to imagine then the American scene with its jazz music and visual culture, characterized by radio, film, new technologies of relation, new music informed by African American blues and roots music, modernity as living and experience, a break again with traditions, with a new sense of possibility and self-invention. Here, I want to read an excerpt from Mary Oppen, but maybe I can't, about, I didn't bring it, okay. Here I could quote from memory George and Mary Oppen's lives, an account given in Meaning of Life, where she describes hitchhiking in a way that is kind of hard to imagine right now. Just getting into the car with people who they've never met, 2 and 3 men at a time, sometimes riding all over the country, sometimes going on a lark in any direction. Direction being less important, as much as the journey was as important as the destination. They led bohemian, nonconformist artist lives, the Oppens. The Oppens were a stark contrast to the materialist consumer culture of the era that was fast approaching collapse in the Great Depression. The Oppens seem not to have been in America during the actual financial crash, but it did affect their plans to publish, to self-invent, and they returned to the States after being abroad to a changed landscape where hardship was seen, palpable. The impact of the Great Depression fed on a succubus of financial capitalism, and its deleterious consequences spread like a virus. Evident in growing unemployment, breadlines, exploitation of labor, anybody who was vulnerable. George Oppen published the Discrete series, a work of astonishingly spare and disciplined poems in 1934, and then turned to the urgencies of the world around him, its economic turbulence, the emergence of anti-Semitism, as he understood it clearly to be the end of the world again, yet again, yet again. The end of the world again, yet again, yet again, yet again. Such hatred fundamental to the worldview and the will to ascend by domination by the German and Italian fascists. With Brecht, Oppen seemed to agree. I'm going to try and screen share my slides here. I have a few slides. It's a Brecht poem, To Posterity. Ah, what an age it is, when to speak of trees is almost a crime, for it is a kind of silence about injustice. And he who walks across the street, is he not out of reach of his friend in trouble? Oppen, the legend many times made, the legend says, but many times more complex, I believe. Turned away from poetry after the first book, maintaining a silence from 1935 to 1960. He made it much more complex than simply an ethical issue. In his essay, The Mind's Own Place, I think it's more complicated than just ethics. It seems also an aesthetic issue. In discussions and in readings that I've done, in discussions in particular with Rachel Blau Duplessis and in reading Michael Davidson and Joy Katz, among others, it seemed that he turned his attention away from writing to tend to and to respond to the turmoil he saw around him. But it was never as simple as that. When I came to hear the legend of the 25-year silence as it was described, I was a young poet enrolled at San Francisco State University, taking classes with Catherine Fraser and Michael Palmer, working at the Poetry Center that hosts me now. I too had a sense of a world that needed tending and a poetry that nevertheless sustained me. The world I experienced was a freezer locker of the Cold War, the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. They were locked into perpetual antagonism, heavy-handed surrogate wars, intervention into history, capital H, that in retrospect were there to give coherence to their own tattered societies. They tried to stop the clock. The actions of each drew into its machinery of distraction and power keeping the status quo, always locked. They called it détente, cultural expression, social movements, and political vision forever in a waiting room. I came of age during Pax Americana of fisted and upholstered with unholstered violence, mixed messages about merit, dangled rewards of human dignity, if one waited with gloves amidst the hierarchies of destiny, class prejudice, and white privilege. This was, I think, more visible to me than it had been to George Oppen, for I never felt free to make his decision, his choice that language or art could command my exclusive attentions, separated across an unbridgeable divide. It was a time of occasional assassination, mass kidnapping of students and intellectuals somewhere over there, the intervention of armed military forces from the United States and civil conflicts somewhere else. A time when the capability for mutually assured destruction could be presumed to remain a preemptive threat, like the gun in Chekhov's instruction, a figurative menace, a hypothetical immolation we might experience. Now, it was a time of certain joys as well, especially of the counterculture and centering youth, euphoric, musical, sexy, Dionysian, revolution, possible, at least linguistically. And in some sectors, revolution could and did cost you your life. It fed a faith that social transformation could be brought about through velvet means. Of George Oppen's silence, the situation of art and ethics, the necessity of change, I encountered it because it was familiar, but it was posed now in a frame of poetry. And the poetry frame that it was presented in was not completely hospitable to the idea of me. There are times when it is almost a crime to write of trees, George Oppen said. I don't know if you could see this. Hold on, let me make sure I'm screen sharing here. Share my screen again. Yep. Okay, here we go. There are times when it is almost a crime to write of trees. There are situations which cannot honorably be met by art. Let's study that. It's instructive to know what time we're in now. Are we in the red zone? There seem to be wailing sirens of alarm. There's something about writing, though, while leaning into the smell of the tree, its bark, breathing it, breathing the same air with it, that helps me to see and think across or through the siren shattered glass, to somehow see through and out. Poetry was never something I could take or leave. The world, poetry was never something I could take or leave. The world and language are, for me, each other's brain food. Site of code switching, taboo breaking, erotic tarry and community building, experimentation, conjecture, knowledge making, world being, world building. Of course, the reality of Oppen's choice was more complex and underwritten by a particular view of art, poetry, and politics, aesthetics, and ethics. On the one hand, Oppen's response was perhaps a turn to and not a turn away, a turn to political exigencies and into a silent part of his writing, a writing not immediately legible as what he was writing in the living in relation to and with his family and neighbors. My sense from reading Oppen now is that he was a solitary. He was inclined and devoted to a few close friends, that writing legibly was for him the unfolding of experience, crafted in dynamic interaction with language materials, not just representation, but enactments of mind, moving through perception and event to words, then the page, the line break and word choice. Words were immanent, makers of the observable world, one refined into constellation of beingness, not the loud clusterfuck pronouncements of ideology, which is not an ethics at all, but gets distributed like red pills to the masses, totalizing units of production and body counts. Now I read Oppen as one possible answer to the question, how does one sing in the ash heap? My selections are taken from Of Being Numerous. There are things we live among, and to see them is to know ourselves. To see them is to know ourselves. As a poet who worked very hard on sort of finding just the right word and using just the right punctuation and all the small things mattering a great deal to his poems, I wonder about these capital letters at the beginning of the line. Is to know ourselves. This famously is in the first stanza of Being Numerous. And I think about them, about the solitary and the solitary's encounter with a world that is multiple and different. The shock of coming back from where he had been where the Oppens had been in exile and coming back to New York. Oh, sorry for the typo. Clarity, clarity, surely clarity. Clarity is the most beautiful thing in the world, a limiting clarity. This one too. So small a picture, a spot of light on the curb cannot demean us. Everything is worthy of attention. Everything, all parts of the perceptual world has information to relay to us. There is a kind of equanimity of the observer to the observed. Everything registers and is finite. Tell the life of the mind. The mind creates the finite. And later, And by this, we are carried into the incalculable, where meaning is a pinpoint moving from one word to the next in a concatenation of illumination. The world is deciphered in careful word choices, pivots, and line breaks. These small pictures are anti-imagist. The imagists were too psychological. This is a Heideggerian philosophy charting consciousness, navigating the oceanic depth of the human, what it is to be inside, what it is to be outside, to be one or many, alone or numerous, especially in a meditation by a solitary, the multiplication of the single person looking at the multitude's plenum. Zhukovsky's poetics emerges for me in these readings in a kind of, when Zhukovsky visits Aristotle's saying nature as created, nature as created. And there are instances of that return to contemplation of the person made by their experience and the person who also creates their experience. Tell the life of the mind creates the finite. And by this, we are carried into the incalculable, that the expansion of the world is actually from looking and considering each particular carefully. I mean, more than carefully, that's almost microscopically, that there's something true and ultimate about this alignment of perception with language. But how do we sing from the ash heap? What is or true as happiness? This is also part of being numerous. What is or true as happiness? I'll sing from the ash heap. I read that question now through a translation device I call otherwise, the otherwise. I call it otherwise in homage to a theorist, Ashon Crowley, has a book called Black Pentecostal Breath that I've been reading lately. And this idea of otherwise is very powerful for me. It helps me to think about the poets that have taught me how to walk otherwise through what the real and what has been presented to me as real, and how to walk otherwise in the ambiguity of making poems in the context of a practice that often teeters and stuns, barrels its way in the direction, in the excuse me, how to walk otherwise in the ambiguity of making poems and in the context of a practice in which the world I live in is often teetering, stunned, barreling as fast as it can with no brakes in the direction of chaos, cruelty, and death. In this body, at my age, with my capacities as a poet, an artist, a person who lives in relationship with others, I feel perhaps more so than Oppen did, that I have witnessed more than my share of culture that gives us literature, gives us rules for interpretation and reception, tells us how to honor it. And it's the same culture that has an awesome appetite for plunder and destruction. How to make sense of that? Akili Mbembe is a Cameroonian philosopher, teaches in South Africa, and he calls our current politics necropolitics, necropolitics. He says, those are the practices by which a society controls and distributes death, as in who dies and who lives and who is human and who deserves dignity. His philosophy follows the work of Black poets whose work has already acknowledged that the apocalypse that many slowly imagine to be near has come. In fact, it came. And we seem to have survived it. I'll share a screen from the much loved poem from the much loved Lucille Clifton. Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life I had no model? Born in Babylon, both non-white and woman, what did I see to be except myself? I made it up here on this bridge between starshine and clay, my one hand holding tight my other hand. Come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. Those words, here on this bridge between starshine and clay, I guess it's an allusion to Keats, according to the Poetry Foundation. He has a line about the divine and earth. My one hand holding tight my other hand to be embodied. Check, make sure, come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and failed. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Or Morrison. This is the thing I wanted to show you. Yeah. One more screen share. A couple more, actually. A couple of poems up here. Oh, this. And oh, my people. This is from Toni Morrison's beloved. They do not love your hands, the body. Those they only use, tie, bind, chop off, and leave empty. Love your hands, love them, raise them up and kiss them, touch others with them, pat them together, stroke them on your face, because they don't love that either. You got to love it, you. How to sing otherwise, except through poetry. For the words on the page are a kind of trace of consciousness, its pivots and dips on the trail of thought, the tensile resistance of language, often as brittle as clay, and also the enactments of wounding, racism, anti-Blackness, inexhaustible and exhausting patriarchy from which one seeks a small relief, but always seems to be, that patriarchy seems to be pulling the strings unseen behind scenes seldom seen. Into this dilemma, how does one sing in a language that would perhaps rather you not sing or imagine otherwise? You have to reframe what you understand to be the practice of poetry and politics. Crawley would say that the practice of otherwise consists of a self-writing practice, a self-invention, not unlike the Oppen's journeys to self-invent, to redraw lines in what is typically construed as legible, personal, political, transparent enough to be read, and opaque. He posits transdisciplinarity, where writing works across the boundaries of discipline to provide a more comprehensive tool for Black study, which is life study, towards a fullness of life that does not depend on the ordinances of death to be free. How do we sing from the ash heap? In our variousness. He says, name yourself. The all Black people is a phrase, a myth, as a phrase is a myth. The violence and death dealing of the current regime and white supremacy is not a myth. And poetry puts cracks into the monumentality of those language structures. Crowley keeps this reader, in study, tuned into the studied benefits from recruiting embodied knowledge into the practice of poetry. To resist the long tradition of rationalism that insists the mind is the central location of experience. When my experience is that my mind is not what people see at all, or see only later on. They respond to when they see me. They see me, a Black woman, not the exquisite phenomenological sensuous apparatus that is my mind. In fact, they are often not responding to anything I have really said, but something they think I have said. Or they are responding to something they said, but they are now attributing to me. Out of this vacuum sealed discourse of binaries, Black, white, female, male, gay, straight, cis, and trans, human and nature, where the life of the mind is finite and so life destroying, possibility destroying, and we can't use it to see otherwise. A little more. How to sing otherwise. Otherwise, possibilities exist in the register of the imagination. The epistemology through which sensual detection occurs, that is the way we think through the world, has to be altered in order to get at what's there. But if infinite alternatives exist, if otherwise possibility is a resource that is never exhausted, what exists, is but one of many. So imagination, and one other quote, I think, from this is otherwise. Airborne. Imagination is necessary for thinking and breathing into the capacity of infinite alternatives. Crowley in their quest for these extra subjective modalities of thinking, studying, breathing, identifies these activities: to tarry, to shout, to whoop, to speak in tongues, to make noise, to move, to play with the sonnet, to use the visual. He describes a hermeneutics for reading and writing culture that would help us break the chokehold of Western thought and the control of bodies, people, and material conditions. I want to stop here with this quote again, and then to go into maybe 3 poems. Imagination, this last quote, imagination is necessary for thinking and breathing into the capacity of infinite alternatives. Because I think my point is that how we get out of these fixities, these binaries, this trap, a death trap, is by using every piece of our imaginations and of our cognitive abilities that we can, and that we experiment and rehearse so that we can, as we read and write, we try to do it in embodied way, even on Zoom, that we do it from our life and from our experience, as well as from our storehouse of words and what we are called into and what is sent to us, so that we can go forward, be sent into the frayed project of becoming human, more human. I'm going to read here my book, new book, Jump the Clock. See how we're doing for time. I think we're okay. I think I have time for 2 poems, maybe 1, 2. Invisible Hands. Trade down the block around the world, down the food chain from forward to back, to escape the air-grabbing heat, the crop failing, the monsoon in June, a fluke of the weather, a storm of flowers, whipped into a rain that claims the last village. The residents head out to the city to make money. They never make the money they seek. Instead, they make keychains and sneakers and baseball gloves and flame-proof nightwear and transmissions and stereos, computer chips, Gap jeans, rugby polo shirts, dolls with the features of Norte-Americanos or slave girls or Indian princesses living their lives in legend, unlike their own, except for an unlocatable middle. And just in time, the chain continues, unbroken, to unwind the thing after the thing, a line of never broken nouns. If it breaks, we fix it quick so the chain can never be broken, even if it shouts out a chorus set to shovel. The rocks never seem to disappear, but become dust, a dust that lasts from morning to morning, chained to a logic we are doomed to follow. Invisible hands rice the peas, spice the rice, circle the turns, turn on the presses, raise the letters, letter the spaces, address the edges before they bang into one another, mask the connections. Invisible hands milk the spill, ship the ink, jump the rope, rip the chute, lay the trail, time the tear, eye the glass, bat the wing, bat the lash, brown the tan, fiddle the sticks, ride the herd, read the horde, hear the roar, read the dim, damp the rhyme the orange, roast the storage. Carry the thread the vow, stall the claws, pour the molds, powder the walls, dent the bins, stamp the bills, core the questions, comma the nouns, time the charts, corner the squares, square the curves, loosen the jaws, spill the beans, bell the cats, feed the beasts. It's years before a family will follow off the edge of the ramp into a putative new life where the past has vanished and the present is all time charts, marked invisibly, only visibly hot in a red dusk of selective vision, in plain sight and out of sight. One hand tries to clap the other, as in the phrase, "Give me some skin." The slap of palms, right hand to right hand, empty, no weapon here. We come in peace. We come out of the hypnotic circle that orbits and holds us in constant bind of stick 'em up and lap dancing. We come out of rigged destiny across the violent border of prosperity and oblivion until hands can be detected again in the bric-a-brac of the world. Thank you. I don't hear you.
I'm talking away and I hadn't unmuted myself. Thank you for that wonderful meditation, Erica. We'd like to sort of, I wish we could briefly unmute and just applaud.
Yes, and also I'd like to see the people's faces, please. That's.
I think what I'd like to do is for us to take a few moments and open it for questions And there's a button marked Q&A where you can enter your questions. That would be really wonderful. And I I'd like to start by asking if you could talk more about um, living in the now and living in the space of otherwise, um, and what you see in terms of contemporary poetry. Um, what relationship is there between the kind of poetry and activism or an idea of otherwise in the imagination?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great question. I think there are many poetic practices and I think writing practices now that um, are trying to grapple in and I don't think, in other words, I don't think it's quite the gulf that it was. I think for Oppen there was a certain kind of entrapment because of belonging, joining the party, which was then sort of the viable alternative to a kind of, a cannibalistic capitalism. Like financial capitalism was really all about taking all the resources and hoarding them, and um, and so now we live during neoliberal capitalism, not changed. Let's just say that. But what I think has occurred, because of a kind of embodied politics, which is also, I think, organized around certain um, aspects of identity, but also of position. There's just much more sense of the political is not just the party or a party. It's not institutionalized. Our lives are political. And so people then can incorporate aspects of their lives, of their family history and so forth into thinking about how is this political and how has this shaped consciousness? How is it race? How is it gender? So you have a lot of archival work, for instance, that I think is very interesting in terms of rereading old texts, this effort to decolonize certain aspects of literature and make it fresh and new.
Mm, nice. Nice. Now I see in the chat, LM, I'm not sure who that is, said, we need a way to applaud and thank Erica for that amazing lecture. So even though the audience is not unmuted, um, and Brenda Ujima, absolutely brilliant and poignant, a lesson in rehearsing our living um, in sensitive relation.
Thank
So lots of thank yous
you.
and wild applause.
Yeah. Well, that's good.
So
And
there is a
I'm sure there
question.
must be a way to sort of um,
There are
people,
two questions that have come
see
up,
people. Oh, here we are. Seeing people. That's great. Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
So Adrian says, I heard your talk a call for experimentation as a way to resist. Could you speak more about the relationship between experiment and resistance?
Sure. I think that it's that we have to have places, and poetry can be that place where we rehearse certain ways of resisting. We rehearse both the consciousness, we rehearse observation, and we rehearse our response, right? We rehearse listening to certain kinds of discourse and being able to pry it apart so that we're not, there's this thing, you hear things, you see them, but you don't, so I should have said,
Mhm.
where are the places where we actually get to experiment and undo things, sort of undo the wrappings of our language and of the way it is packaged to us? Certainly, it's hard to notice unless one has a place to um, be analytic, be playful,
Mhm.
suppose, change the frame, get under the hood.
Mhm. Okay. We have a one, no question, but a thank you. Then we have A question from Susan Bernofsky. Thank you for this wide-ranging and really rich talk. What you said about Oppen's years of silence as something that his privilege allowed him to take makes so much sense. I'm wondering, what do you think that got him as a poet? Also, some of his lines that you quoted made me think he had to be thinking a lot about translated poetry. That's
Mhm.
not a question, except that we do know much about his translate. We do know much about his translation life, if he had one. Do we? Do
That's
we
not a
know
question.
much about? She's asking, do we know much about
Um,
his
that's not a,
translation?
he must have read German, but I don't know if that I can actually, I don't know if I can answer that question. Perhaps someone else can. Mhm.
Okay. Um, Thank you, Susan. That's Rachel Blau Duplessis. Just a tiny question of your biography. How would you summarize just a bit more than you did the way Oppen was viewed, even when you encountered him then in SF at the time? Because, of course, there is an unbridgeable divide with Oppen. I agree, but want to hear your memories from the 70s. This does not speak to the brilliance and richness of the lecture, just a bit of Oppen's feeling for you at the time.
You know, I was a student poet, and so my meeting of Oppen was brief and fleeting, and it was Mary Oppen who I did meet in person. And I, you know, I was a student poet, so there was a kind of, and you know, I couldn't, you know, uh, quite, I couldn't quite put myself, you know, up front because there were many other poets of, you know,
Mhm.
we have our ranks, as you all know, and those ranks were close in on him. You know, and the, you know, in terms of my own study of the objectivist, I was much more drawn to Zukowski than to Oppen's work initially. I read Oppen, I read I'm being numerous, but Zukowski was the, for me, the interest, and in part because there was so definitely, I responded to a communal, more of a communal vision, you know, in the work. It was, Oppen struck me again as a solitaire.
Mhm. Okay. And let's see. Say say more about Zukowski.
Who's this?
This is Rachel.
Okay, Rachel. um, hmm, uh, it might also have to do with that. I read Zukowski with a group of people in a Zukowski reading group that you know, consisted of the Bay Area language poets at the time, and so that reading was also communal. But even within that, this was a maybe one of my first encounters of a kind of writing, poetry, a poetics, and a theory of language, all kind of all interwoven, and that those things could coexist. So, you know, I know there are poets who have a divide. There's poetics here, and there's theory there, and there's poems, which are, you know, sort of the impromptu, you know, the sort of impromptu inspirations and so forth, maybe with some craft. But I actually find that those things, poetry is interesting because it is capable of holding so much, of encompassing so much in terms of how we think with language, how language is sort of uh, uh, how we are embedded in language, and it also forms our thinking, and then also our social relations, all done through language. That wild, that wild practice that we do where we think we share a common language. Somehow it works out, you know. But I'd like to know how.
And more sometimes than others.
Yes, the person
But
talks to others. I love this. How is this? But we do, and we can move together with some terms that we come to understand. I'm very interested in this new word that people use, care, and how care has become elaborated, and also how it comes and it stems definitely from feminist practice, but now has entered the language and now expands the possibilities of behavior and observation and
Mhm.
and and politics.
Mm. So we have a question from Sean Nagus. I was wondering if you could say more about the relationship between poetic consciousness and passage through the material world. What do you think defines poetic consciousness and its dynamics?
Mm. Yeah, I'm so in this case, in this respect, I am, I hew to certain aspects of Oppen and the objectivists who were, I think, very where they sort of play around with the skirts of phenomenology. That is, there's no consciousness without consciousness of. That we're always in our consciousness is of something. And so thinking is in relation to not only the material world, but also to each other. I mean, to the social world too. And um, and there is, I guess, a kind of, you know, no, it's there might be I don't know. I'm having a hard time imagining what's pure thinking. Maybe
Mhm.
mathematics, but I think that through language we are always turning over the material world. We're always, in and especially as we think through things.
Okay. We have a question from Lydia Cortez. Rehearse resistance. Is this part of the experimentation?
Yes, yes, yes. Rehearsing. I just taught a class on the performance class called Poets Theater, thinking about how um, how we use any text and we can rehearse it in various ways, so that it's not just a neutral set of words on the page. It has a frame and it has a tone and a delivery and a register. And we can also play with those things. And playing with those things actually helps to build up a muscle inside us so that when we have a chance to name ourselves or to speak to what we observe or to call something out or to call somebody in, all of those things are not just done impromptu, but really come from a place of having considered how words can actually convey something when it's embodied.
Mhm.
Completely different, it adds to meaning to embody it.
Thank you. A question from Jason Lipless. Can you please speak more about the relationship of spoken and written? I loved your revisions, repetitions, sonic manifestations here and how they broke the formality of the lecture structure.
Yes. Yeah, I'm becoming more attuned to how a text is performed. And as I was describing this poets theater, but really broadly seen. I mean, we did theater. We performed things that weren't theater. We performed texts. One of the challenges was to perform something that had no dramatic content whatsoever. But how would we deliver the instructions off the aspirin bottle? I mean, and make it interesting, and to really play in this space of a kind of embodied language and what difference it makes. Uh,
Right.
mhm.
Did I interrupt you?
No, 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 no. I did. That's probably enough, there for
Okay.
that. Yeah,
Can you take a couple more questions?
a couple more.
Okay.
Mhm.
So there's an appreciation from Omar Barada. Thank you, Erica, for a beautiful lecture meditation reading. I loved how you moved seamlessly between poets, Oppen Brecht Morrison, theoreticians, Mbembe Crawley, and your own embodied experience throughout. I was wondering what differences you make, if any, between those elements, poetry, theory, lived experience, as resources for learning to otherwise sing from the ash heap.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah. Um, um, I um, I think there are different modalities of learning, and that most of us use multiple modalities to learn. I'm influenced by Howard Gardner, among other people, who theorize multiple intelligences. And and certainly we have strengths. Some people are more analytic, and they can read theory, and they read it, it runs through them. For me, reading theory means that I always have to say, well, what does that mean? What would that look like in my experience? And I always have to make that extra step. I'm also an interpersonal learner. And when I teach, I'm always interested in creating the learning community by which we co-create the context for knowledge development, knowledge building. So it's not the teacher, sort of me or somebody else, pouring information into the empty vessels of the participants, but rather how is that co-created? And how is knowledge shared in a way that, again, respects the different modalities, the different ways that people learn. Some people learn through their bodies, and they can't, if someone just gives them a piece of paper or doesn't speak to them or doesn't like get into a dialogue about it, then they haven't learned it. It just passes through them. And in fact, passive learning is probably the worst way to teach anybody anything. It always has to be somehow interacted with. What if we made our poems that way? What if poetry was that? That it was an art form which engaged on multiple levels of embodiment, dialogue, paper, theory, music, the sonic, the whoop, the glossolalia. All of that was not put outside of the learning environment or what was a place of knowledge building, knowledge development, but actually brought in so that we could all co-create this thing that we're trying to sort of that grows us. Art grows us, right? We're trying to grow us. So how is that going to happen?
So there are lots more questions, but I think we're going to, it's hard to pick actually. One, I'm gonna, huh. So I'm gonna merge two questions, right?
Okay. Yes.
One points out, this is Kathy Lou Schultz says, I'm understanding otherwise as other epistemologies, such
Mm,
as how poetry can stimulate other ways of knowing, as the
mm,
imagination engages the intellect. She's interested in your thoughts about how poetry may then stimulate radical forms of empathy that are
mm.
lacking in our current necro-political moment. And great question. I would actually tie it into Anne Waldman asks, say something about the rage, and on
About
the
the
other, about the rage, and on the other hand, the equanimity of, because you talked at one point about being a late middle-aged woman in a state of rage,
yes.
right? That was there
Yes.
for you, and say something about the rage, and on the other hand, the equanimity of the observer to the observed. Um, that's a lot.
That was a lot because you also threw in empathy. But but let me try to talk about the
The
rage is the thing. I feel like they want to keep me mad. Because anger is also got kind of a limited palette, right?
Mhm.
There's only so many, how much of the how much it is human to be enraged in the current times, but it also, there's a funny way you're only playing one part of the keyboard.
Well, also,
And
they also don't want you to express your rage. So to
yeah,
keep you enraged so that you're kind of off balance, right? If
yeah,
you're able to express your rage, you're able to get past it to a kind of equanimity.
yeah,
But, you
yeah.
get shot or locked up if you.
That's what I'm saying. So there's that. And also, you're right. And also to feel it and to express it is an important part of that process of, I guess, surviving.
Mhm.
There's also this other part of the keyboard, which is like thinking and strategizing and
Right.
doing something and growing and, loving, which is reparative. So how does that, how do you work, how do you manage to use more of the keyboard? And I feel like that's also important
Mhm.
to the practice of poetry. That was that section that said, well, there is that tree, and sometimes I just want to lean into the bark and breathe with the tree,
Right.
because otherwise it's, I'm constantly on the rescue squad of either myself or a neighbor or someone else who is experiencing harm, right? So there's also the reparative, and where does that come in? Um, that the reparative is actually a better term than equanimity. Maybe one never accepts it, but one learns how to take care. That word again, care of oneself. I think you use the word empathy, and with that word also comes um, an idea that Diana Coy Nguyen introduced to me of radical empathy and her interest in radical empathy. Um, and there, I think, again, it's about what parts of ourselves do we can we engage, and how do we encounter that? How do we elicit those parts of the human, right? Which they keep you busy at the angry end, but how do you elicit all the parts of you that actually allow the possibility of an otherwise?
Thank you. There are more wonderful questions. Maybe you can look at them some other time.
Mm-hmm.
But I just want to say thank you for really thoughtful, provocative meditation. Thank you, audience. Can we unmute everyone and give Erica?
Faces. It'd be nice to see faces.
You can see names. I don't think we can see
See
faces.
faces. Okay. Okay. Full screen. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. It was really a pleasure to speak with you all tonight. And I hope that at the end of this, we are in a room and we are listening to each other read poems.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Erica.
Yep. Thank you. Good to see you. Or not. Good to be with you. Mhm.
Hey, Missy.